economic woes. It led to a deal, the Transfer Agreement. That story on Chicago Tonight with John Calloway. Tonight, author Edwin Black, Rabbi Byron Sherwin of Spertus College of Judaica, and Rabbi William Frankel, past president of the Chicago Zionist Federation, discuss the Transfer Agreement controversy with host John Calloway.
Good evening and welcome to the program. And Edwin Black, thank you very much for being here this evening. Help me set the stage, if you would. If I understand, it's 1933. Your book centers on 1933. Hitler has just come to power. The German economy is in a terrible mess. It is really threatened by the prospect of a worldwide Jewish boycott because Hitler hasn't wasted any time going to work on the Jews inside Germany, punishing them in all sorts of ways. And then, as a result of this, and we're jumping way ahead, a deal is struck, which you call in your book the Transfer Agreement. Give us a capsule of what that was, and then we'll work our way backwards.
In exchange for the transfer of Jewish people and money from Germany to Palestine, the Zionists agreed to sabotage the boycott, which threatened to topple the Hitler regime in the first year.
So that it is a deal with the devil, in effect, and it divided badly the Jewish world.
A deal with the devil to save Jewish lives.
And to create a Jewish state, you're arguing.
To save more Jewish lives.
You're saying that's the first priority.
That's right.
Would a Jewish state, would the state of Israel exist if this deal hadn't gone through?
Without the continuing economic relationship between the Third Reich and the Zionist movement, it seems doubtful that there would be a state of Israel as we know it today.
And if the boycott, which never did finally come to the fruition that it potentially could have, had come off, could Hitler have been put out of business early on in 1933 or 34?
For a several-month period during the spring and early summer of 1933, there was a chance that if all the Jews were organized and the Zionist movement was behind them and the American Jewish Committee was there and the Christian world was mobilized, that the Hitler regime could have been toppled through the economic chaos that would have resulted. But there's no question that the blood of the German Jews would have been discovered underneath the ashes of the German economy, because the retaliation and the massacres against the German Jewish hostages in Germany would have been certain. By the time the summer of 33 comes, it's very difficult to overthrow the Hitler regime, and the chances diminish radically as we get into 1933, and then it's simply a holding action to keep Hitlerism within the borders of the Third Reich and stop its spread from the rest of Europe.
All right, and it is because the Jews inside Germany are being held hostage. 600,000 of them, in effect, are being held hostage in 1933, that Jewish leaders, the members of the Jewish Committee in the United States and other Jewish leaders around the world are saying, go easy on this notion of a boycott because you may enrage Hitler and you may see the punishment even worse. Was that not the governing factor against an immediate, total boycott?
That was the governing factor by those Jewish leaders in America who were of German descent. Those Jewish leaders who were of East European descent and or who represented an East European constituency, such as the American Jewish Congress, the Jewish War Veterans, felt that the only way to stop Hitler was an effective boycott, was to protest visibly, to isolate him diplomatically and economically, and that we could not stop just because there were threats of reprisals. They knew that by opposing the Tsar several years earlier, they had increased the attacks upon the Jewish hostages there, and at that time they said Jewish blood must be spilled in the war of liberty. But it's understandable how people could be fearful at that time for their own kith and kin living in Germany.
And the ironies are incredible in this story, because there was a deep relationship between the Jews in Germany and Germany as a nation. Germany, you write, had in effect saved the Jews in Palestine from annihilation from the Turks during World War I.
That's right.
There was this great love of Germany and the culture of Germany by many of the Jews. And while the deal was being made to get the German Jews to Palestine, the German Jews were the last Jews on earth, apparently many of them, who wanted to go to Palestine, anywhere else but Palestine.
That's right. The German Jews were one segment of the Jewish community which considered themselves anti-Zionist. They considered themselves 101% German. They were Germans who were by accident of birth of Jewish religion. Many of them were Reformed Jews, Jews of little identity, and the last place they would have gone to was Palestine. It is an extraordinary irony in one of the telling stories of the transfer agreement how an organization and a movement within Germany that represented just 1 or 2% of the community became the custodian of the entire...
Zionism only represented 1 or 2% of the Jewish population of 600,000 in Germany, you're saying?
According to its own best estimates.
1933 in Palestine, you've got the Jewish portion of Palestine, you say, is only 4%. The Arab part's 20%. Great Britain has the rest in mandate. Half of that is desert. You're saying 800,000 Arabs, 200,000 Jews in Palestine at that time.
Roughly.
Now you introduce a character named Sam Cohen, who is the deal maker, at least at the beginning. Could it be argued that this is another one of those incredible chapters where somebody's really out to do good and make profit and change the course of history?
That's exactly what the character of Sam Cohen is. This man was half devil and half deliverer, as he was called by his own associates and the people who knew him. He thought that by his own contrivances and intrigues, he could deliver the Jewish people to the Jewish homeland and in the process turn small profits.
Edwin Black, let me be just a little bit adversarial for the sake of discussion. The publicity surrounding the publication of this book indicates that it was a very daring thing for you to do, to write this book. And yet, when I read it, you wrote it with compassion and context, and I'm saying this is another chapter of where we see captors making deals with captives and captives making deal with captors. Devil's agreements are riddled through history. We see Ronald Reagan tomorrow night going to China to sit down with those devil communists, and everybody's kind of seeing the context of that. Was it really, I mean, is it really all that big a deal?
You are quite right. The fact of the matter is, those who criticize this book and those who criticize the transfer agreement are those who have not read the book and those who are not familiar with the agonizing details surrounding the tragic choices that the Jewish people had to make. This book accuses no one, but everyone is so afraid that they're going to be accused that they're worried about the book. They're frankly worried.
Now, your parents were among those who were worried before they had a chance to read a 100-page outline. What did they say to you when you first told them that you were going to do this book?
Well, my mother said she was going to sit shivi on me, which, as you may know, is the Jewish ritual of mourning for a loved one who has died. And my father, who himself was a Zionist Beitar partisan who fought against the Nazis, literally offered to strangle me. And I would not proceed without their blessing. And I finally convinced him to read this 100-page outline that you just mentioned. And it pointed out where the research would lead me and what the facts were. And when my parents finally read it, they said, now we understand things we could never understand before. Please go and write the book.
All right, we'll be back with more of that story and with some response to your book right after this. To help us in this conversation about Edwin Black's book, The Transfer Agreement, I want to introduce Rabbi Byron Sherwin, Spertus College of Judaica, and Rabbi William Frankel, who is a past president of the Chicago Zionist Federation. And Rabbi Sherwin, if I understand correctly, you in part were influential in Edwin Black's writing of this book. How do you feel? Tell us that story and how you feel about it.
Well, it was in June of 1978. Edwin, who I didn't know at the time, called me regarding a story he was doing for the Sun-Times in connection with the Nazi march in Skokie. and the article had to do with anti-Semitism in America. In the course of our discussion, in response to one of his questions, I mentioned the transfer agreement. He responded by saying, such a thing couldn't have existed. It's impossible. A year and a half later, he called me back and he said, you remember you mentioned this thing called the transfer agreement. Was there really such a thing? I said, yes. He said, well, where can I find out about it? I said, it's documented in every one of the major histories of the Holocaust. There were at the time 4 major histories of the Holocaust, beginning with Polyakov's in 1954, down to...
But I'm sorry, let me interrupt. Why was it important, you think, that it be written? Why would you encourage a writer?
I didn't encourage him or discourage him. He was so enthused by the story that he took it
But
himself.
you put him on to it originally.
I put him on in the course of that interview to many things. And this was the one that seemed so incredible, so unbelievable, that he decided to pursue it.
Have you read the book?
I've read it through a number of its transmigrations in various manuscripts.
What's its value?
Its value is, I think, that it opens up an area of Holocaust studies, an area of Jewish history, an area of American Jewish history that has been kept very quiet.
Rabbi Frankel, how do you feel about this book?
Well, let me say this. The problem with the book is the way it's being perceived in the community before having been read. And that is largely due to the publicity which surrounded it. For an example, another network announced a program in this book in a rather questionable manner.
Is this the Channel 5 piece?
I didn't want to mention
Well,
it.
we're all friends. Let's just call them...
Yes, the Channel 5 piece, giving a picture of some kind of a sinister plot between the Zionists, whatever that means, and the Nazi government. When in fact it was, incidentally, as Rabbi Sherman mentioned, this can be found in any encyclopedia. The Encyclopedia Judaica has an article on the subject. It's nothing sinister. It was an arrangement. The possibility that the boycott would actually topple the Hitler regime was a far-fetched possibility.
Now, I'm sorry to interrupt, but when you say it's not to be viewed as sinister, at the time, if we can believe Mr. Black's quotes and research, there were quite a number of persons who felt that it was doing business with the devil, right, and that it divided Jewish groups and Jewish individuals and non-Jews all over this world.
It did. It did.
So that the characterization of it as sinister is certainly...
Retrospectively, it did succeed in saving 60,000 German Jews and brought $40 million to Israel. And in fact, it did not do much for the German economy, because that money did never reach Germany. It was German goods which were exported to Israel with money of German Jews which would never have left Germany.
I have one last question before we go to phone calls, Mr. Black, and that is that you make a great deal. I think you're on record here and elsewhere as saying that this really was critical to the eventual development of the State of Israel. And yet, if only, and maybe only isn't the word to use, 60,000 German Jews from 1933 to 1941 ended up in Palestine. And there are already 200,000 to start off with, and many hundreds of thousands would follow. Statistically, it doesn't sound like that's it sounds to me like you can make an argument that Israel would go on and become a state sooner or later anyway.
You're right. It's not the 60,000 German Jews that came over. It's the $50 to $100 million in assets that came over, which expanded the Palestinian economy, increased the general immigration quotas for East European Jews, that allowed hundreds of thousands of East European Jews to come in, escape the spreading Nazism of Europe.
We're talking, the term leveraging is what we're talking about here.
They built the country.
We need to make, I think, one more point clear, and that is that the British mandate charged, if you wanted to get out of Germany, you had to pay the equivalent of $5,000 or 1,000 pounds, wasn't it?
No, to enter Palestine, you needed 1,000 pounds, but you couldn't take 1,000 pounds out of Germany. I'd like to also mention that although the transfer agreement is cited as a fact in many Holocaust references, that's all it is. No one knows no one knew the details behind it. No one knew its relationship to the boycott.
So there's a lot of original reporting that went on here.
About 80 to 90% of it.
All right, now we have phone calls, and we'll go to them now. Good evening. You're on the air.
Hello?
Yes, go right ahead.
Yes, Mr. Calloway. I'd like to ask Mr. Black, what was the role of the British government in this transfer agreement, being the fact that Palestine at that time was a British mandate. Did the British have some part in the negotiations between Mr. Cohn and the Nazis?
The British were often go-betweens between the Zionist organization and the Nazi regime. They initially thought the transfer agreement was a great idea because they thought that British goods and services would abundantly supply the growing Palestinian economy. At the last minute, they found out that it would not be the British merchandise that would be purchased, but German merchandise, and then they decided to take a hands-off policy.
All right, we have another call. Good evening, you're on the air.
Yes, could you please tell me, I happen to be from Germany myself, and my family was quite Zionist already before World War I, and you stated that the German Jews were not identified at all with the Zionist cause, which I consider not completely true, because in Germany there were actually intellectual and sports organizations which were very identified with the Maccabier, which became then an official event even in Israel, and you claim that the German Jews never wanted to identify themselves with Herzl and the Zionist cause.
Well, that's a little overdrawn, is it not?
No, it's not. The most authoritative reference on German Zionism is the History of German Zionism by Richard Lichtheim, who was, of course, on the Zionist Executive Committee, who says nowhere among the world Jewish communities was Zionism more rejected than in Germany. The organizations to which you refer, the Maccabee Sports Organization, was a transcontinental organization which was indeed Zionist, but it fell under a special category known as non-Zionist, which was a contrivance of the German Zionists to control Palestine without becoming nationalistically involved.
Rabbi Frankel, you wanted to comment.
Well, I'm not of German birth. I'm Viennese. I was born in Vienna. I can tell you this, the Zionism was rather strong in Vienna. I'm aware there was strong opposition to Zionism in Germany. At the same time, the German Zionists made a major contribution later on to the upbuilding of Israel.
And that is reported on in the book. I mean, that is actually reported, but it was considered in some circles a sacrilege, was it not?
In some circles, I would question the percentage of 4% only.
But I want to go back to you for just a second.
These are their own numbers.
Is there any other objection you have to this book other than the way it's been publicized and promoted?
Well, within the few minutes we have here, there's some minor reservations I have. For an example...
Well, but I'm not talking about minor reservations. I'm talking about substance.
Well, the division...
Nick picked this thing to death.
The division between Eastern European-born Jews and German-born Jews. The German-born Jews in this country were more concerned about German Jews than Eastern European would have been. I think may not be justified.
Okay. I think we have another call. Let's go to the... Good evening. You're on the air. Hello? Did we have a call? Do we have another call?
Hello.
Yes, you're on the air.
Yes, hello.
Good evening. You're on the air.
Yes. My objection... Hello?
What's your question?
My objection to this book is that not so much what it reveals, but the way it's being portrayed and the fact that money is being made in the manner it's as a commercial venture on the backs of Holocaust.
All right, let's talk about the money part of this. I guess the premise is you're getting rich quick on the grief of other people.
Well, I suppose if the book becomes a double bestseller and makes tons of money, my debt would only be diminished by about $50,000. I personally went into debt to the tune of $100,000 on this book. When the book was finally launched, it was assumed that it would be a commercial failure. There is no way that I could ever make up the money that was spent on the book. I'm paying about $20,000 a year in interest. That does not account for my time.
Did you pay all those people who helped you do all the translating and digging into all the various libraries around the world?
I paid for their planes. I paid for their translations. I recruited college students. I recruited retired Holocaust survivors.
How much did Macmillan advance you on it, may I ask?
Well, the original book was bought by the New York Times Books and then was switched to Macmillan. But the total advance amounted to about 7% of the total cost.
Okay. We have another caller. Good evening. You're on the air.
Should I talk now?
Yes, you should.
Oh, thank you. You see, I didn't know that, but I'm wondering whether Mr. Black seriously considers the effect of a Jewish boycott being of such strength that it would affect Nazi Germany?
I'm glad you raised that question. I wondered if that part of the drama, and you really make it quite a narrative, isn't overplayed a bit.
Well, it's very simple. If Hitler did not think the boycott would overthrow the Third Reich, why would he help build the State of Israel?
Well, he would, because there is evidence that he wanted to get rid of the Jews any way that he could, and that was a way of doing it.
He could have gotten rid of the Jews without giving them assets. He could have gotten rid of the Jews by his own timetable. He could have gotten rid of the Jews in many, many ways, and he could have just annihilated the Jews.
But he was intrigued by the notion of a state, was he not?
No, he opposed the notion of a state. It wasn't until approximately 1937 to 1938, after the Peel Commission, when Britain recommended partition, that the Nazis looked around and said, my goodness, what have we done?
But, I mean, he overruled Eichmann at one point.
Yes, he did, at the very end. You're getting into my second book, though.
All right. Rabbi Frankel.
Well, in this case, I must disagree with the author. The Nazis in 1933 were not prepared to embark on the Holocaust yet. The German people wasn't prepared. The world wasn't prepared.
Yeah, but they got off to a really tough start on people, beating up on people.
But mass extermination was not on the agenda as yet.
That's true.
In that case, they were most eager for the German Jews to leave. Every time a German Jew left, an apartment was vacated. There was a shortage of apartments. A job was opened up.
That's translated. I mean, that's reported in the book.
And much of the money remained in Germany because only 1,000 pounds could be taken out through merchandise and so forth. Consequently, the Nazis had an interest in seeing the Jews leave. That's why he did it. But there were no immediate economic gains.
Before we go to the next call, Rabbi Sherwin, I asked you earlier what the value of this was, and you talked about its historical value. Is there any value in terms of our understanding current events and how we deal with policies and so-called enemies and in the real world today?
Well, I think that it has some relevance regarding, say, current policy between Israel and other countries.
How?
Say, for example, the question which I think is at the matrix of the book is the question of whether or not the Zionists of the Jewish Agency were primarily interested in building the state or whether they were interested in saving lives. Where Edwin and I disagree is on this question. I think that their major interest was building the state. Saving lives was only a secondary interest.
Yeah, it seems to me that the book makes a great case for the premise of many of the Zionists being that Hitler was just the latest in a long line of oppressors, and that in some respects Hitler was a blessing because it says you've got to get on with making this state, otherwise you will run into Hitlers for the rest of existence.
That's quite true. Just about 10 years before, actually in 1919, most scholars don't know this, 100,000 Polish Jews were annihilated within the span of 18 to 24 months along the Polish to Russian border. A plan to ship en masse 600,000 Polish Jews to Palestine was abandoned because they knew that 200,000 would starve to death within a few months, and another 200,000 would be forced to re-emigrate elsewhere, and only 200,000 would be left. They could not accept these numbers. This time, the Zionists wanted to make sure there was a state to come to.
All right, let's go to another call. Good evening, you're on the air.
The Zionists wanted to know there was a state to come to, but also I think we're missing the point. The main point is that thousands of lives were saved, and whether there was an accommodation between the Zionists of Germany and the Nazis or the world Zionists really doesn't matter.
Sir, let me argue that some might argue that it does matter because the accommodation was made in the absence of what could have been a total boycott. Had the boycott been effective, Hitler could have been put out of business early, and the Holocaust could have been prevented. Mr. Black argues that's oversimplified, etc., but that can be an argument.
I agree with Mr. Black. It is an oversimplification, because you have to remember, 1933-34 was in the midst of a depression. The depression was not only in the United States, but it was worldwide.
Right.
Every country was looking for a market. Germany definitely wanted a market.
Right.
The United States probably has the largest overseas population, or had the largest overseas population, of Germans.
And it had a president, Franklin Roosevelt, who was in no mood not to be nice to the Germans.
He was in no mood not to be nice to anyone at that time.
Right. He needed all the business. Rabbi Sherwin.
I think it's important here to interject one other fact, and that has to do with the support many of the unions in this country during the early 30s were giving to the boycott. It wasn't simply a Jewish issue. One of the first things Hitler did when he came to power was to abolish the unions. And therefore, the unions in this country, say the Longshoremen's Union, had an interest in backing the boycott. And therefore, I think there is some credibility to the claim that the boycott might have been successful. And indeed, this is the claim that's made by the individual who has written a book, a PhD dissertation on the boycott, Professor Moshe Gottlieb, who claims that the boycott would have been successful and in 33 would have toppled Hitler, and consequently the Holocaust would not have occurred.
Moshe Gottlieb doesn't say that. Forgive me. Moshe Gottlieb's work, which was pioneer work, really thought that the boycott would not have been effective because he didn't understand it. What Byron says is quite right, though, and what the caller said is quite right, and we must remember this. A lot of Jew haters participated in the boycott against Hitler for their own reasons. There were Polish anti-Semites involved in the boycott. Everybody wanted to horn in on the German market.
Okay,
and so
you raised the question. I'll hit you with your last question in the book. Was this deal madness or was it genius?
I'm sorry, I never answer that. I can't.
I'll tell you, this book was an education for me. It just was filled. This book is filled with things which I found extraordinarily helpful. Yes,
As one who lived under Hitler, I must tell you, any solution other than the one followed by the Jewish Agency would have been irresponsible. We had to fight Hitler on two fronts. One, the boycott. On the other hand, we're saving lives. The immediate task of saving lives.
Rabbi Frankel, thank you very much. Rabbi Sherwin, Edwin Black, thank you very much for being with us this evening. I'm John Calloway. Good night.